The first sound that felt out of place was the steady thump of machinery, low and patient, carrying across the south pasture before the sun had fully burned the haze off the grass. I was standing near the fence line, checking a gate hinge that never quite lined up the same way twice when the vibration reached my boots. Not loud, not aggressive, just persistent enough to make me stop and listen. Out here, you learn the difference between wind, livestock, and something mechanical that doesn't belong. The ranch stretches wide, and the boundaries aren't obvious unless you know them. Old survey markers sit half-buried, some dating back decades. The land rolls gently, with shallow dips where water once ran more freely, before pipes and planning redirected it underground. I've always believed the visible land is only half the story. The rest is buried, quiet systems doing their work without applause. As the sun climbed, dust began to lift in thin curtains near the southern boundary. A backhoe moved with deliberate precision, its arm biting into soil that had not been disturbed in years. Bright paint marked straight lines that cut against the natural curve of the pasture. Survey stakes stood like thin sentinels, freshly planted, confident. I didn't walk over right away. That's never been my approach. Instead, I leaned against the fence and watched, counted movements, noted where the trench line angled and how close it drifted toward a stand of old mesquite trees that marked the edge of my land. Beyond that line sat a newer development, neatly arranged homes, identical mailboxes, trimmed lawns. The HOA managed that side of the world. Eventually, a woman stepped into view, clipboard tucked against her arm, boots clean enough to tell me she hadn't been walking the fields long. She spoke with the crew, pointing, nodding. Calm. Efficient, the posture of someone executing a plan already approved somewhere else. I recognized the rhythm immediately. HOA work often moves like this, quiet certainty backed by paperwork and momentum. Assumptions built layer by layer, reinforced by signatures rather than soil. I took photos from where I stood. Wide shots first, then closer ones zoomed in on the trench depth, the angle of the cut, the markers stamped with measurements. I didn't wave, didn't call out. There was no urgency yet, only a tightening awareness settling in my chest. Because beneath that stretch of ground, well below where the bucket was digging, ran a water line I'd installed years ago. Privately maintained. Essential. Designed with foresight, not convenience. And as the trench grew longer, I realized how little margin there was between their progress and what they didn't know was there. I stayed where I was, watching the earth open inch by inch, waiting to see how far they intended to go before someone asked a question they hadn't planned for. By mid-morning, the trench had lengthened enough to change the way the land looked, like a quiet scar drawn with a ruler instead of a blade. I drove the perimeter road slowly, keeping the truck well back from the activity. From that angle, I could see the depth better. The soil profile was clean, topsoil folded neatly to one side, heavier clay stacked on the other. Whoever planned this expected to go deeper, not just scratch the surface. That detail mattered. I stopped near one of the older fence posts and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into ground still cool from the night. The sound of the backhoe idling filled the pauses between movements. Metal on earth, earth yielding, over and over. The woman with the clipboard noticed me then. She walked over at an unhurried pace, careful to keep her distance from the trench edge. Up close, she carried herself the way administrators often do, measured tone, neutral expression, confidence drawn from process rather than place. "Morning," she said. "We're coordinating an HOA infrastructure extension along this boundary." Her phrasing was precise. Along, not into, boundary, not property, I nodded, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel intentional. "I see that." She explained the scope without being asked. utility improvements, drainage alignment, future-proofing. Words chosen to sound responsible and forward-looking. She referenced permits approved months ago, surveys conducted by contracted firms, and shared access assumptions that, in her mind, already settled any uncertainty. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I asked where the trench was expected to terminate. She pointed down the line, tracing a path that ran uncomfortably close to where my records said the water line crossed at a shallow angle. Not directly beneath, close enough to matter if someone misjudged depth or shifted course to avoid rock. I thanked her for the information and told her I'd review my own documents. She smiled politely, already turning back toward the crew. The interaction ended as cleanly as it began. No conflict, no raised voices, just two people standing on different sides of an invisible ledger. Back in the truck, I pulled out a worn binder from behind the seat. Laminated maps, installation notes, photos from years ago when the land was quieter and planning happened with patience instead of deadlines. The water line was marked clearly, its depth measured conservatively for long-term resilience. I checked the GPS coordinates against the trench alignment I'd photographed earlier. The margin had narrowed since morning. Still, I did nothing. Observation first, documentation always, interference only when necessary. As I drove away, the sound of digging followed me for a while, fading gradually. The land looked unchanged from a distance, but I knew better. Somewhere beneath that fresh soil, systems waited, silent, essential, and increasingly close to being discovered the hard way. The next morning began the same way most do out here, light creeping in low across the pasture, shadows stretching long before they pull back into themselves. I walked the southern fence line on foot this time. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of disturbed earth from the previous day. Even before I saw the trench, I could tell they'd made progress overnight. Fresh tracks crossed the service road, and the soil pile had grown, darker clay now exposed beneath the lighter top layer. The digging had continued closer to where the land subtly dips. That dip isn't dramatic enough to notice unless you've watched it through a few seasons. Water once pooled there briefly during heavy rain, long before the line was installed to redirect flow. That history mattered. Ground remembers even when plans forget. I stopped near a faded marker I'd set myself years ago, an unassuming post with a small metal tag half obscured by grass. It didn't mean anything to someone scanning for survey paint or modern flags. But to me, it was a reminder of choices made carefully, with distance in mind. The backhoe operator worked steadily, guided by string lines and chalk marks. No hesitation. No reason to doubt the plan handed down to him. A few feet deeper and the trench walls grew sharper, the soil more compacted. This was no longer exploratory digging. It was committed. The HOA representative arrived shortly after, her truck pulling up in the same place as before. Clipboard in hand again. Same calm, same certainty. She walked the trench, checking measurements, speaking quietly into a phone. Approvals, confirmations, progress reports. I stayed back, taking notes of my own. Times, depth estimates. The direction of the trench relative to my records. Each detail went into a log I've kept for years, not out of suspicion, but because land management rewards memory. At one point, the backhoe paused. The operator leaned out, inspecting something in the trench wall. My attention sharpened, but after a brief discussion, they adjusted slightly and continued. The pause passed without incident, though it told me something important. They were making micro-decisions in real time, responding to soil and obstacles, not just lines on paper. That's where assumptions break down. I considered stepping in then, a quiet mention, a question framed as curiosity, but the trench still sat inches above the water line's depth. Close, but not there yet. Instead, I documented the pause. Took photos of the exposed soil layers, the trench profile, the adjusted angle, evidence without accusation. By afternoon, the digging stopped. Equipment shut down. The land exhaled into silence. The trench lay open, a clean cut waiting for the next step. As the crew packed up, I noticed how little distance remained between their planned depth and the infrastructure below. How one more decision, made in the name of efficiency, could change everything. I closed my binder and headed back toward the house, the quiet heavier than before, knowing the ground had more to say, even if no one was listening yet. By the fourth day, the land itself seemed to anticipate what was coming. I noticed it in small ways at first. The soil near the trench had begun to dry unevenly, cracking where moisture used to travel unseen. The fence posts closest to the work vibrated faintly when the machinery started up again, a reminder that force doesn't stop at visible boundaries. I arrived earlier than usual before the crew and walked the trench line alone. Without the noise, the cut looked deeper than it had felt the day before. Shadows pooled at the bottom, making the measurement deceptive. I dropped a weighted line from the edge and checked it against my notes. The margin was thinner now, uncomfortably so. When the crew returned, they brought additional equipment, smaller tools, finer adjustments. That signaled a transition from bulk excavation to precision work. Precision demands confidence, and confidence often dulls curiosity. The HOA representative approached me again, this time initiating the conversation. "We're adjusting the depth slightly to accommodate a junction point," she said. "Still within our permitted range?" Her tone wasn't defensive. It didn't need to be. From her perspective, everything was proceeding correctly. I asked what reference they were using for subsurface clearance. She tapped the clipboard. "Utility maps provided during the survey phase, nothing flagged in this section." Nothing flagged. That phrase landed heavier than she intended. I nodded and told her I had older records for this land, predating the development. I mentioned a privately maintained water line that crossed the area at a deeper level. Not as a warning, just as information. She paused then, just long enough to register the possibility, but momentum is a powerful thing. "Our data didn't show that," she replied carefully. "But if you have documentation, we can review it." Review later, after progress had already been made. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I offered to share the records that afternoon. She agreed, already glancing back toward the trench as the operator signaled readiness to continue. I stepped away again, returning to my position near the fence. The machine resumed its work, the bucket carving with incremental precision. Each pass shaved inches, not feet. Controlled, confident. I watched the trench floor darken slightly as it approached a denser soil layer. My chest tightened, not with fear but with recognition. That layer sat just above the water line, designed that way intentionally. I took more photos. Close-ups this time, depth markers, soil texture, the slight sheen that hinted at retained moisture below. When the machine stopped for the day, the trench sat within a hand's breadth of the line's protective buffer. Invisible, intact, for now. As the crew left, the HOA representative lingered, looking down into the trench longer than before. Not alarmed, thoughtful. The land remained quiet, but the balance had shifted. Awareness was beginning to replace assumption, even if no one said it out loud yet. That evening, I laid the documents out across the long table in my office, the way I always do when decisions need to slow down. The maps were older, edges softened from handling, annotations written in a hand that assumed time would pass and memory might not be enough. Installation depths, angles, redundancy notes. The water line wasn't just a pipe. It was a system designed to feed livestock, irrigation points, and a small processing operation that depended on steady pressure year-round. No shared access. No easement granted. Entirely private. I scanned everything into a digital file and organized it chronologically. Photos from installation day. Soil measurements. Receipts. Not because I expected resistance, but because clarity is easier when nothing is missing. The next morning, I met the HOA representative near the trench again. The light was sharper now, casting clean lines along the cut. I handed her a tablet and walked her through the records quietly, page by page. She studied the maps longer than I expected, traced the line with her finger, compared coordinates against her clipboard. "This runs closer than our survey indicated," she said finally. I agreed, not triumphantly, just factually. She made a call then, stepping away a few paces, speaking in low tones. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. The pause itself mattered. When she returned, her posture had shifted. Still professional, still calm, but less certain. "We'll need to pause excavation in this section until we reconcile this," she said. There may have been an oversight, another careful word, but it carried weight. The crew shut down earlier than planned. Equipment idled, then fell silent. The trench sat open, exposed to the light, no longer advancing. I didn't feel relief so much as validation. Preparation had done what confrontation never could. Over the next few days, surveyors returned. New markers appeared. Measurements were taken again, slower this time. Questions replaced assumptions. The HOA representative checked in regularly, sharing updates, asking for clarification rather than asserting certainty. The water line remained untouched, unseen, doing its job as it always had. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low, she stood beside me at the fence line looking out across the pasture. "We should have asked sooner," she said. Not as an apology, as an acknowledgement. I nodded. "Land rewards patience." She smiled faintly, writing something in her notes. The work would resume eventually, adjusted and informed. But for now, the ground rested. Systems aligned. Authority recalibrated quietly, without spectacle. As I walked back toward the house, the ranch felt unchanged on the surface. Yet beneath it, order had been preserved, not by force, but by knowing what lay below before anyone forgot to ask. The pause changed the rhythm of the place more than I expected. Without machinery starting up at dawn, the southern pasture returned to its older sounds. Wind moving through grass, distant livestock shifting weight. The subtle creak of fence wire adjusting to temperature. The trench remained, covered loosely in places, marked clearly now with fresh flags and warning tape that hadn't been there before. That visibility mattered. What had been invisible infrastructure was now part of the conversation, even if it still lay buried. The HOA representative arrived later that week with a different set of people. Not operators this time, but planners. They stood farther back from the trench, discussing angles and alternatives rather than depth and speed. Clipboards multiplied. Tablets replaced measuring rods. She approached me with a revised layout. "We're proposing a reroute," she said. "Shallower farther east, it avoids your line entirely." I studied the map. The adjustment was modest on paper but significant on the ground. It respected the land's natural slope instead of fighting it. More work for them, less risk for everyone. "It makes sense," I said. She exhaled slightly, the tension she'd been carrying finally easing. "It adds time, but it's better." Better, not faster, not cheaper. Better. Over the next several days, the trench was partially backfilled, compacted carefully. New lines were marked. The crew resumed work with a different posture, slower, more deliberate. Questions were asked before buckets moved. The ground responded accordingly. I continued to observe, document, and stay mostly out of the way. My role hadn't changed, but the dynamic had. I was no longer an unknown variable on the edge of their plan. I was part of the context. One afternoon, the HOA representative stopped by without a clipboard. We stood near the old mesquite trees, watching the adjusted trench take shape. "You've clearly planned this land for the long term," she said. I shrugged. "It outlasts me. The least I can do is not rush it." She nodded, thoughtful. "We don't always get that perspective." The statement wasn't defensive. It was reflective. As the days passed, the work blended back into the landscape. The trench lines curved more naturally now. The dust settled evenly. Nothing felt forced. And beneath it all, the water line continued its quiet work, never exposed, never threatened again, not because it demanded attention, but because someone had finally taken the time to see what wasn't obvious. I realized then that this hadn't been a conflict at all. It was a correction, a moment where preparation met assumption and without noise shifted the course of things. The land held steady, and so did I, content to let patience do what it always does best. With the reroute underway, the work settled into a quieter, almost respectful cadence. I noticed how the operators now stepped down into the trench before each new section, checking walls and depth by hand instead of relying solely on measurements from above. The machinery moved less aggressively, pausing more often. Progress continued, but it no longer pressed forward blindly. From my side of the fence, I kept my distance, though not my attention. Observation is a habit, and habits don't fade just because tension eases. I logged changes, photographed the new alignment, and updated my own records to reflect what had been adjusted nearby. Long-term planning doesn't stop once a problem is avoided. It absorbs the lesson and moves on. The HOA representative checked in every few days, usually with a brief update and a question or two. Nothing dramatic, just coordination. It felt less like oversight and more like collaboration, even if neither of us used that word. One morning, she brought printed copies of the revised plans and handed them over without ceremony. "For your files," she said. I appreciated that. Not because I needed permission, but because it closed a loop that had been left open too often in situations like this. As the project moved farther from the water line, the land relaxed. The uneven drying near the original trench evened out. Soil settled. The fence post stopped vibrating when equipment started up farther away. Standing near the old marker post again, I thought about how close things had come. Not to disaster, but to complication. The kind that doesn't announce itself until systems fail quietly and people scramble to assign blame. Instead, nothing failed. The HOA representative and I spoke less now. There was less to say. When she did stop by, our conversations drifted away from permits and alignments and toward the land itself, how it behaved after rain, where it resisted change, where it accepted it. "You know this place well," she said once. "I had time," I replied. She smiled at that. By the end of the week, the original trench was fully restored. Grass seed had been spread, straw laid down to hold it in place. In a few months, it would be difficult to tell anything had happened there at all. But the record remained. On paper, in files, in memory. As I walked back toward the house that evening, the sun low and steady, I felt no need to revisit the moment when I could have intervened earlier or pushed harder. The outcome had been shaped by restraint, not reaction. The land doesn't reward those who rush to be right. It responds to those who take the time to understand it before asking it to change. Once the major work moved beyond the boundary, the ranch returned to something close to normal. The equipment noise faded into the distance, replaced by the slower rhythms I'd grown accustomed to over the years. From a distance, you wouldn't know that anything significant had nearly gone wrong. The pasture looked continuous again, unbroken. Only the newer survey markers, set farther east, hinted at the correction that had taken place. I spent more time reviewing my own systems after that, not out of concern but awareness. I walked the line where the water pipe ran beneath the ground, checking the surface for subtle changes, settling soil, unexpected moisture, anything that suggested stress. Everything held steady. The HOA representative stopped by one final time while the main crew worked well away from the ranch. She carried a thin folder instead of the usual clipboard. "We've updated our master records," she said, handing it to me. "Your water line is now clearly marked in our system." That mattered more than she probably realized. Not because of this project, but the next one, and the one after that. I thanked her and asked how often those records were revisited. "More often than before," she said with a small, knowing nod. We stood there for a moment looking out across the open land. No tension, no unfinished business. Just space doing what space does when it's respected. Before she left, she paused. "I'm glad you didn't stop the work outright," she said. "It gave us time to see the problem clearly." I considered that. "Stopping things abruptly doesn't always create understanding," I replied. "Sometimes it just creates resistance." She smiled, then headed back to her truck. As the days passed, the ground continued to settle. Grass began to take in the restored area, thin at first, then thicker. In another season, even I would have trouble pointing out where the trench had been. But the experience lingered, not as frustration, but as confirmation. Preparation isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It waits patiently until it's needed. Out here, the most important systems are the ones you rarely see. They don't announce themselves. They just work, until someone forgets to look beneath the surface. I locked the binder back into its place and returned to the routine tasks that keep the ranch moving forward. Content knowing that foresight had done its job without ever needing to raise its voice. The weeks that followed carried a different kind of quiet, one shaped by awareness rather than absence. I noticed it when a utility truck slowed at the ranch boundary instead of pulling straight through as it might have before. The driver stepped out, checked markers, made a call, and only then proceeded. Small behaviors, but meaningful ones. The land was being read before it was acted upon. I continued my routines without change. Gates checked. Lines walked. Logs updated. The water system ran steadily, pressure consistent, no signs of stress. That consistency is easy to overlook until you almost lose it. Then it becomes something you guard carefully. One afternoon, I received a printed notice from the HOA. Routine language, administrative tone. It outlined the completion of their infrastructure expansion and referenced coordination with adjacent landowners. My name appeared once, correctly spelled, attached to a brief note about existing private utilities. That single line told me everything I needed to know. Later that day, the HOA representative stopped by again, not because there was an issue, but because the process required closure. She stood at the fence line, reviewing the final inspection checklist, then looked up. "This project will probably never be talked about," she said. I considered that. "That's usually a sign it went the way it should." She nodded. "We've adjusted how we approach boundary work. Slower at first, more questions." "Questions save time later," I said. She smiled at that, then handed me a signed copy of the completion report. No ceremony, just confirmation. As she drove away, I walked the southern pasture once more. The ground felt firm underfoot. No vibration, no tension. The land had absorbed the interruption and returned to itself. I stopped near the old mesquite trees and thought about how easily the situation could have tipped in another direction. Not through malice, but through momentum. Work tends to move forward because stopping feels inefficient, even when stopping is exactly what's needed. This time it hadn't come to that. The correction happened in motion, guided by information rather than force. The ranch remained intact, not just physically, but in principle. Planning had outpaced haste. Documentation had spoken when voices didn't need to. As the light faded and shadows stretched across the pasture, I felt a sense of completion settling in, not because something dramatic had been resolved, but because something quiet had been handled the right way. The land doesn't ask for recognition, it asks for understanding, and when it gets that, it rarely asks twice. The last change came without announcement. One morning, I walked the southern boundary and noticed the final survey flags had been removed. No tape, no temporary markers, just the land, uninterrupted again. The adjusted infrastructure sat well away from the water line now, its presence acknowledged but no longer pressing against what had already been there for years. I stood for a while, letting the stillness settle. The absence of activity felt earned, not abrupt. That difference mattered. Later that week, a brief letter arrived from the HOA. It wasn't an apology or a justification, just confirmation that their records had been finalized and that all future work near the ranch boundary would require direct coordination. The language was careful, procedural, and calm. Exactly what it should have been from the beginning. I filed it away with the rest of the documentation, not as a reminder of conflict, but as evidence of alignment. Systems only work when they acknowledge one another. The water line continued its steady service, unseen and uninterrupted. It didn't demand attention, and I didn't give it more than necessary. That was always the goal, to build something resilient enough to fade into the background. I thought briefly about how easily the situation could have escalated. A confrontation at the trench, a demand to stop work, voices raised in the dust. None of that would have protected the land any better than patience did. Instead, awareness shifted authority quietly. The HOA didn't lose control of their project, they gained clarity. I didn't assert ownership through force, I demonstrated it through preparation. Out here, land remembers how it's treated. It responds differently to those who rush than to those who pause and listen. That lesson isn't written into permits or surveys, but it's one worth carrying forward. As the season moved on, grass reclaimed the last disturbed patches, blending them back into the pasture. Soon, even a careful eye would struggle to find where the digging had once crept too close. And that was fine. The ranch remained whole. The systems beneath it remained intact. The work above ground continued, corrected and informed.